Hey everyone, Curse Deck Builder here, making our way to 10,000 decks assisted, and here we have Fynn the Fangbearer Deathtouch Tribal. This deck comes to us by donation from longtime friend of the channel, Phil. Phil says, speed it up a bit and maybe a bit more resilience. And they say that the main thing is that it's Deathtouch Tribal. It contains no infect or toxic cards in the deck, and that's on purpose. These are definitely things that we can work on, and we're going to have a good time looking at the deck. I don't know about you guys, but I had to shovel my driveway today, so I am a little tired, but I'm really excited to get into this deck. So, as always, it's a great time to remind you that the deck list and a link to where you can submit your own deck lists can be found in the video description down below. So, let's get at it. Who is Fynn the Fangbearer? Fangbearer. And why are they the leader of our Deathtouch Tribal deck? Well, this is pretty simple. Fynn is a 2-mana 1/3 human warrior who has Deathtouch and says whenever a creature you control with Deathtouch deals combat damage to a player, that player gets 2 poison counters. And then of course a player with 10 or more poison counters loses the game. Now, this is a pretty straightforward commander for a pretty straightforward deck. We're going on aggro, we are playing Deathtouch creatures, and we're aiming to basically defeat each opponent in 5 hits. And we're going to have a little bit of proliferate and a few other things to kind of back up our strategy. And that's it. That's the goal. Remember, it's not the amount of damage that we do that matters. It is that we do damage at all. This is very, very much so akin to Toxic, but as mentioned before, there will be no Toxic in the deck. So looking at the deck itself, it's pretty straightforward, though there's a few things I want to attack right away. The deck itself is built almost primarily of Deathtouch creatures and ways to get those Deathtouch creatures in. However, we immediately notice a terrifying problem. We are 31 lands. Now, Phil had asked for the deck to be sped up a little bit, so we will be reducing the curve, but even then, the first thing beyond anything else is we're going to add lands. Now there's also a low amount of non-basic lands. We have almost primarily forests. I don't think this is the worst problem. I think there's other ways to attack, but as obvious reasons, if we put in a few more utility lands in green, we're going to be pretty happy, especially when you consider, even just cyclers, even just things that put like a +1/+1 counter once. These kind of things will be really, really nice in a deck like this. We're low to the curve, so I think I'd still like to go to 35, 36, and we're going to try to reduce the curve on the higher stuff to kind of make that easier. And as you can see, like this is the reason why our curve is a very natural, kind of smooth curve. But for a deck that's trying to be fast and aggressive, a lot of this is just a little too far. So we're going to try to do some cuts here and there. So let's take a look at which cards kind of stick out at me as cuts. As often in these kind of tribal or typal or kindred, I think it's kindred decks, it does make sense that a lot of our slots are mainly chosen for us. We're looking for low mana Deathtouch creatures. We're missing a few, but I'll be suggesting them in here anyways. But with that in mind, we want to be looking at our higher stuff of what we want to keep and what we don't want to keep. Now, there's a few cards here that give Deathtouch, things like Bow of Nylea, and a few, where's our Orhan Frostfang, which always sounds like a legendary creature name, but I digress. Now, Orhan Frostfang, I feel like is good enough that it doesn't matter that it gives Deathtouch, but something like Bow of Nylea, I think it's not required as much, right? Because we have really good attacks. The majority of our creatures have Deathtouch. We don't need to be giving them Deathtouch. And in the situation where someone does something like, I think Dress Down is the best example, where all of our creatures lose Deathtouch. We could give it back with Bow of Nylea, but oftentimes they're going to be using that after we attack, so it won't work anyways. So I think I'm going to be a little picky on things that give Deathtouch. And I think Bow of Nylea is the only one. I said I'd go to the high mana, and I got distracted immediately. Let's get back to that. The other one I wanted to talk about was Sereth. Sereth was one of the higher mana cards that gives Death Touch that I think we can easily cut. I really do like the idea of giving untapped creatures you control hexproof, but I think that's really a fancy way of giving our commander, hexproof. And even then, like 4 mana, I think is too much, and it doesn't let our commander attack, which is a useful thing we can do. So starting here right away at 4 CMC, I already have any card I think above 3 CMC that doesn't immediately help us win the game, I'm going to be a little suspicious of. So Sereth, very easily, I think we could cut that very, very quickly. Whereas something like Questing Beast is very clear how it helps us. It's a Death Touch haste creature with vigilance. It has evasion, which is really, really good, and that it stops our damage from being fogged. Overall, just a really, really strong card. So like this is the standard I want to hold the rest of the cards too. Toski is very strong, though I have this kind of feeling, and I don't want to get too much into it because I think the deck will bear testing. So Toski is a really strong card because what it does is it immediately allows us to start drawing cards off of our creatures connecting. And a lot of our strategy involves our creatures connecting. But therein lies a bit of a problem, right? If our creatures are connecting all the time, we've won the game. So Toski becomes kind of win more, right? Because for him to be good, we need to be doing our strategy, and we need to be doing our strategy well. That being said, I still think it's a strong enough card that I think is worth keeping in the deck. Same thing with Oron Frostfang. Like, these are just really, really good cards. So with that in mind, I want to keep them in, but they're on my radar of cards that, like, they might get cut at a certain point, because if you're getting 4 cards out of Toski, you've probably already won the game, is my opinion. But I'll leave that for testing. Acidic Slime, I think, is too cute. 5 mana to destroy target artifact, enchantment, or land. This is Beast Within with extra steps, and a 2/2 Death Touch is on theme, but just too late in the game. You can't reanimate this creature, you can't blink this creature. I don't really want to play it. I think I'd rather it just be a land, honestly. Bellowing Tangleworm I like because it gives evasion, so I have no problem here. God Eternal Ronus is something... This is something I've seen in other lists that run it, and I am a little confused. I do get the idea behind it, because it has Death Touch, and it will return from the grave or exile a lot. But what it does is it increases power, and what's funny is I'd rather it increase toughness. If this card doubled your toughness in this deck, I'd be so much happier, because once again, it's not the amount of damage you do, it is the fact that your creatures get in and stay alive. So God Eternal Ronus just feels out of place here, and at 5 mana, I don't really think this is what we want, especially when you remember that this card doesn't do anything after ETB. It's just a 5/5 Death Touch for 5, and I don't think that's particularly good here. So all things considered, I think God Eternal Ronus is an easy cut. Kura I like a little more, because at least Kura has evasion with flying and Death Touch, and has at least one relevant ability. I feel like the Spirit Tokens is fine, but even then, this collection of abilities doesn't really seem to jive with the deck. We're really playing it for a 4/4 Death Touch creature, and I feel like we can do a little bit better at 5 mana. So I would probably cut Kura as well. Said before, Oron Frostfang is a strong card. I don't mind it. Once again, same thing with Toski. These might be cuts, but at the moment the strength is so strong that I have a hard time saying no to them. Soul of the Harvest likewise feels a little strange, just because it doesn't have Death Touch. I do like it has evasion, and don't get me wrong, it will draw you cards, so I am hoping to keep this in the deck, but at the same time, I feel like this card, there's going to be certain boards that you play this card and you run out of creatures, or you just cannot maintain casting creatures after each other. But with the additions I'm suggesting, we're going to go up in 1 mana creatures by quite a bit. So I would like to keep Soul of the Harvest for that reason. Looking below, Vorinclex, Monstrous Raider, which doubles the counters you put and halves the counters your opponents put. This is fantastic. I really, really like it. Even without the Death Touch, I think this is just a fantastic card that you'll be really, really happy to finish the game off with. And then we have our last two, which are our highest mana cards, Hornet Queen and Craterhoof. And the thing is I am having a hard time with both of these cards. Let's start with Hornet Queen. I think when we compare this to Kura, this feels a lot better, right? For 7 mana, we're getting 5 bodies. And remember, it is the number of, it's when we do damage, it's not the power we do. So this is the ideal version of a swarm summoning for the deck, right? This card represents 10 poison counters just by itself, which I really, really like. However, it has the same problem where the main ways we tend to use Hornet Queen and Commander is to blink it, it's to reanimate it, it's to cheat it into play, and this deck kind of has a hard time doing that. However, it's still like a really, really good finisher. So the scales are really close to evening out here. And to me, it's still going to lean just a little too much onto, this is too much mana cost for the ability. This deck is really low on mana. It's 32 lands technically. And even if I wanted to go up to 35, 36, that's still too few to be reliably casting Hornet Queen. Hornet Queen is just going to be a dead card in your hand almost the entire game. And even then, without haste, which we'll get to, this is not a card that comes in and wins the game immediately. With haste, I like this a lot more, but without the haste, not so much. And Craterhoof is similar, but the ceiling is higher, right? Craterhoof, you pay the 8 mana and you immediately win the game. But there's still something to be said that this card is coming out, and the real thing it does is it gives trample and enough power to trample through. You don't need this card hitting each opponent for like 20. You just need enough of your Death Touch creatures to get through, right? To immediately poison out your opponents. And if you're not familiar, Death Touch Trample is a really good combination because you only need to assign 1 point of damage to each blocker, and then after that, the rest goes to the player. So when you think about it, Craterhoof Behemoth is kind of overkill. Like, I don't know if it should just instead be Overrun, as Overrun is just 3 mana less and probably has, like, if you think about your Death Touch creatures, +3/+3 means that each Death Touch creature can block 3 creatures each before it can no longer do the poison damage. And for that reason, I think Overrun is just better. Like, Craterhoof is a fancy, fun card, but it's just too much mana and it's a little overkill, whereas this will do what you need it to do just as easily, right? Even so, if you could find like a 4 mana version, is that I think all the other ones are 5 mana. I know Triumph is 4 mana, but we don't want to give these creatures Infect because that's part of the deck building restriction. But if we have like a 4 mana card that, let me see if I can find it real quick. So let's say 4 mana, creatures gain trample. And so let's see if there's anything that really quickly has something like that. Up to 2 target creatures, up to 4. Distribute 4. This might be the best then. Maybe Storm the Seed Core, because it's close, right? Because I think honestly I would still prefer Overrun just if I had more than 4 creatures. But if I have 4 creatures, giving them each +1/+1 vigilance and trample is probably enough to take 1 player out of the game in 1 attack at 4 mana. But for 1 more mana, getting +3/+3 instead is a huge difference. So I'm gonna say probably Overrun's better. All right, those are the high mana costs there. Let's take a look here. Let's see. Overwhelming Encounter feels like, okay, so this is just, I didn't know this card existed. Okay, so it's just better Overrun. So maybe just cut the card for a land. All right. I do like this a lot because I did feel like +2/+2 was enough. So this is the perfect kind of amalgamation of the things I wanted. Good job, Phil. You've done well. With that in mind, I think a part of me is still wondering if I want another copy with Overrun, or if I just want to substitute this into a land. And I think it's close. If I'm taking both of these out, I might want the second finisher and still have Overrun. Oops. And still have Overrun. But I think it's going to depend on how many lands we put in. So I'll leave it to the deck builder to decide. Spinning Wheel Kick is close. So it's 4 mana for the first removal spell, 6 mana for the second, 8 mana for 3 targets. And I think that's too much, right? That's too much. Would you pay, in mono green, would you pay 4 mana to remove a creature? No, because bite spells here are 2 mana. Would you pay 6 mana to kill 2 creatures? Maybe. But you definitely wouldn't spend 8 mana. Okay, you might spend 8 mana for 3. I don't know. I think this is overcosted. I think you're going to have a hard time getting the mana to make this worthwhile outside, because at the lowest rate, you don't want to do this, right? You absolutely do not want to pay 4 mana for 1 creature, but you would pay 6 mana for 2. So with that in mind, I think I would say that I would like to take this out. I think even then, it's just really hard to get to the mana that's worth it. And I think you're going to find a lot of the times you're spending 4 mana on this when you don't want to. So for me, that's an easy cut. And you could replace it with any fight, any bite. There's a lot of bites that are available. I think there's a new one, Cosmic something from March of the Machines, which is an easy fix because it's an instant speed bite, and you're just going to have an easier time with this. I know the ceiling on this card is really, really good. That like 8 mana, you clear someone's blockers and then you take them out of the game. I think you can still, like, that's just really hard for your deck to do. So, Plane-Wide Celebration. I guess this is here for the proliferate 4 times. I don't think this is good. This is a lot of mana to, like, 7 mana put 4 poison counters on each opponent sounds really good, but that's probably not what's going to happen. First, you got to get to 7 mana, and there's a chance that your opponents are either out of the game or can counterspell this, or you wanted any other spell that you could hold it, like you could use removal or use a combination of spells. This is just it's really brute forcing the problem, and I think I would honestly rather just repeatedly proliferate Contagion Clasp, even if it's more mana than Plane-Wide Celebration. It's over time, and it lets you hold up removal, it lets you do other things. I think this is just, once again, this is just going to rot in your hand, and if we're going to build up the speed of the deck, we should not be relying on 7 mana finishers. So Plane-Wide Celebration, easy to cut. Great Aurora, not quite sure why this is here. I do get the idea that this is going to benefit you the most. You shuffle all of your permanents out, you draw that many cards and put that many lands into play. But that sounds incredibly dangerous with 31 lands, that yes, you're going to draw a ton of cards, but also you're going to be low on lands, and yeah, you're going to have low mana creatures, but you probably still want enough lands to play them all out immediately, right? Because they're going to come in untapped and you're going to immediately play that many cards. This is a really cool card. Don't get me wrong. I really like this, but I just don't think this is the deck to run it in, right? You want to play this in some kind of chaos deck, some kind of deck that can really, really benefit by having either a lot of really interesting lands to play, or you want to ramp really, really hard or go into tokens so you get the most cards out of this. I don't know. This deck just feels like the wrong place for this. And once again, it's 9 mana. I don't see you ever casting this. So easy cut. Finally, let's go to the last few high mana spells. Cage Sun is close. I like Cage Sun in monocolor decks, but you really need to be able to ramp into it reliably or cheat it into play, because 6 mana is quite a bit to get to. And then there's the thing that you're not really using the second ability of the creatures getting +1/+1. Don't get me wrong, there's an element that I've been kind of not talking about, which is, what does this deck do when your commander's not in the game? And I think the answer is it proliferates, right? I don't think you play this deck in a way that well, they hated Fynn out of the game, I guess I should have a backup plan. I don't think that's correct. I think you have to really go for the fact that you want to get at least one poison counter on each of your opponents as fast as possible. And then immediately after, if Fynn is hated out of the game, you're going for the proliferate win. So what does this card do for either of those strategies? It doesn't do anything for the infect strategy because the +1/+1 doesn't matter, or sorry, the poison counter strategy. And the doubling of mana is cool, but you're at 6 mana to get this. Like, you have to think about this card taking you from 6 to 12, and you don't need to go from 6 to 12. You need to get to 6. That's the goal here, right? It is not the trouble of getting to 12. So with that in mind, I really don't think this is a deck that this card belongs in. I really do like this deck. I played in like, and Phil has seen this, I think, my Ashnod deck, where I can use power stones to get this out. And that's where it makes sense to me, where you can just cheat it out of play. But here, you have to kind of naturally get to 6, either by playing 6 lands or using one of the few ramp cards that are available in the deck. And I'm going to be honest, that's not worth it. So I think Cage Sun is a very, very easy cut. Then Contagion Engine is good. I do like Contagion Engine. I think it's definitely worth playing. It's a much better version of Plane-Wide Celebration because it has an ETB and then it has an immediate like next turn, or if you get to 10 mana in one turn, which I don't see coming. But like, I think being able to proliferate twice for 4 mana is exactly where this deck wants to be. This is the finisher that once you put that 1 point of infect on everyone, after which you can just basically start, if Finn's out of the game, you can slam Contagion Engine, and now you've represented a pretty fast clock if your opponents can't interact. And I really do like that. And then the rest I think is fine. Asceticism is not a card I tend to like, but here I think I'm going to be easier on it because of the importance of keeping Fynn on the board. And by the time Asceticism is coming out, Finn's probably 6 mana, so that curve is really, really nice. And so I don't mind that as much, but it is the kind of card I don't tend to like. Primal Order is interesting. I guess it's like a value card here, and I don't think it's terrible because it is a kind of a clock. But if we're trying to speed up the deck and have the synergy working a bit better, I do think this is something I don't particularly like. Okay, so I think that's it. There's a few more here and there. Fire Shrieker notably is kind of interesting to me. The Double Strike is really, really interesting, but I think this is weird, but I think I'd like First Strike more because it's probably easier to put on a creature to make a creature not unblockable, but like it's forced to chump. Because when you put Double Strike on one of your creatures, it is being forced, like they're going to chump it anyways. And Fire Shrieker is really, really, it's 5 mana to equip in this way. And like with 3 and 2, I would rather more swords. I'd rather like, I don't know, any other sword. Probably the green-black sword, the red-blue sword, Fire and Ice, or Feast and Famine, respectively. Because at 5, like this creature, if you can get attacks through to your opponents, I don't know if that Double Strike is going to matter so much. I think like if you're able to get your attacks through, you're winning the game, and then you can just lean on Proliferate more. This Double Strike, all it does is add 2 more poison counters, which is huge, but like it's the equivalent of 1 other creature. Whereas if you think of it in the means of 5 mana, can represent at least 2 more creatures, which will do the same thing. So Fire Shrieker is close, but I don't particularly like it. Okay, and I think that's it. Let's go into additions, because I think overall, let me see how we're doing on time. Yeah, we're doing great. Overall, I think the rest of the deck is really, really nice. I think one more I'll stop on is Hornet's Nest. Feels a little hard to trigger. You're literally playing this and hoping your opponents will attack into it. That feels kind of bad, but I understand that the ceiling on this card is really, really high. I will say most people will be holding up blockers against you, so you don't need to work, like this is just not going to come up, but something worth noting. Okay, let's go to additions. So the first one I want to put out there is something for our commander, and it's Myth Unbound. So Myth Unbound says that basically it halves your commander tax as long as it's out, which I really, really like. And then whenever your commander returns to the command zone, you draw a card. This combination of abilities, I think, is really especially strong with Fynn, because Fynn is going to probably die a lot, and this will make a really, really big difference, mainly because Fynn is a low mana commander, and by having his commander tax, we're only incrementing by 1, and slamming him out turn after turn becomes really feasible with the fact that you're drawing a card every time you do so. So this, I think, is the easiest inclusion out of all of them. But I really, really like it, and I think it's very, very strong. Let's move on. Rancor. Rancor is something that I think is notably missing. I think this is a very, very good enchantment here. I think Trample is very, very strong in a deck like this. I think Trample and repeatable Trample is very, very strong. And the fact that it gives +2, and the fact that it keeps going back to your hand, makes it just like a really, really easy inclusion. As I said before with like things like Overrun, +2 means that it can go through 2 blockers with Trample and Deathtouch. So most times people are not going to be blocking this creature once it has Rancor, because it just doesn't matter. It's going to get through. And yeah, if they have tokens, they're going to get it, like put it in the way, but otherwise, they're just going to be trading their creatures and still getting poisoned. And so with that in mind, I think this is an incredibly powerful threatening card for the deck. Then what do we equip with these kind of things? Well, I wanted to add in at least 3 more Deathtouch creatures that I saw. Moss Viper, there we go, Mirkwood Spider, and Fang of Shigeki are all 1 mana Deathtouch creatures that the deck is missing. And I think, honestly, this is the thing that speeds up the deck. We want more 1-drop Deathtouch creatures. Why? Because the simplest way is this represents a turn 2 two poison counters on an opponent, right? Turn 1, you play the Fang of Shigeki. Turn 2, you play your commander, attack. You're very, very likely to get in, and you're very, very likely to immediately start poisoning your opponents. However, there's something else I like, which is a different kind of play, where you actually just curve the 3 of these. So turn 1, Moss Viper. Turn 2, let's just say Mirkwood Spider and Fang of Shigeki. And then turn 3, you summon your commander. And then you attack each opponent with one of these creatures. Now, this isn't always going to work out because it's turn 3. If you're not the first player, it might be really hard for your opponents to all not have blockers. But it is a method to ensure, like, to try to go for that first I guess the first 2 poison counters on each opponent incredibly fast. I think I do prefer the other way because you can work around your opponents, you know, having a creature here and there, and you can kind of figure out who's the most likely to throw down a creature the fastest, and then you can target them with the first one. But this does give you the most amount of attacks on turn 3, and I think that is rather, rather good. So with that in mind, I think this is the strongest way to power up the deck and gives you the most options, because once these come through, immediately you get the poison and you can kind of move on to the next half of your deck. And something I would suggest is that things like Soul of the Harvest, as I mentioned before, get a lot better when we have these 1 mana drops. Same thing with Guardian Project. So I do really like more 1-drops. It allows us to keep our curve low. Do note that I still do want the curve to be like, I still want more lands in this deck. I don't care how many 1-drops we put in. 31 is still really, really rather low. So I think I would still like more, but it will smoothen out the curve quite a bit. Another 1 mana card that I think is missing is Thirsting Roots. I think this is just, both sides are really, really good. One is to get the land, the other is to proliferate. It fits perfectly into the deck and should be in there. And I do have one more, actually I have 2 more 1 mana cards, but I'll get to them in a second. I just have a few more creatures and at least 1 more bite. Let's start with a bite. Infectious Bite seems to be the most interesting to me because it gives a poison counter to each of your opponents and it allows you to just use the bite. So this does the whole thing I was trying to describe where we're trying to get the right attacks through to ensure each of our opponents have a poison counter. This does it in one spell. And so, as I said before, I tend to think of this deck as in phases, and the first phase ends the second each of your opponents have an infect counter, sorry, a poison counter. And this just gets you there in one card. So I do really, really like this, and I think it absolutely should be in there. Another card with Deathtouch that I think was kind of missing is Skullwinder. And I think Skullwinder is just really, really good, both being obviously a Deathtouch creature, but also the fact that it is an Ewit. It is a selective Ewit that also helps an opponent, but an Ewit nonetheless. It's just a really, really easy inclusion. You can use this to get your bites back. You can use this to kind of get your creatures back. You can use this to get Fynn back after Fynn has died quite a few times and you leave him in the graveyard instead of the command zone. I do really like that. So I think this is a nice value card, but maybe not the most important card to include. Then we have Defiler of Vigor. Now this creature does not have Deathtouch, but it does turn all of our green creatures' first mana pip into a Phyrexian green, and it does grow the rest of our creatures. Now, as I said before, the strength of our creatures isn't as important, but adding to that toughness is really what we want to do here, I think. I think adding to the toughness allows us to get our creatures to live through attacks. Plus, I mean, like Toxic, it just gives us another avenue of taking out our opponents in a way that is just tacked on to an ability we really, really want. Just think of the way that this ability with things like Guardian Project or Soul of the Harvest and our 1-mana creatures is an insane card advantage engine. So definitely really like this. I think it's the strongest Defiler by far. So absolutely, I think this could be on the top of your curve somewhere. I really do like it. Alternatively, another card that I think could be at the top of your curve is Eldrazi Monument. Now this one is trickier, which is why I don't want to just easily suggest it. This one's trickier because the deck doesn't have the means that I like it to have to get around the Monument's downsides. Traditionally, we want, either tokens or we want aristocrats or reanimation or something like that to get around the fact that we have to sacrifice a creature each turn. We don't have that ability. We are going down a whole creature every time we do this. Now, there are some cards that we're fine with sacrificing, like Pollenbright Druid, which doesn't really do anything for our game plan after it ETBs, and that will be really good Monument fodder. But I will say, the +1/+1, the flying, and the indestructible, mainly the flying and indestructible, to be honest, are really, really good. And I would be very, very willing to take that loss of a creature a turn for these two abilities. Because as soon as we get flying and indestructible, we are attacking every single turn. Now that first attack, that's going to be the hardest one, because your opponents will make the most blocks because they'll still have the most amount of creatures. But if you can survive for that turn, or Eldrazi Monument can make it to your next turn, your next attack will probably be lethal against at least one or two opponents, because you still have evasion and you still have all the creatures you kept from that initial attack. And I'm going to suggest something. I'm going to suggest that if you play this, you get that attack in, and then on your neck, during your opponent's turn, they destroy the Eldrazi Monument. I'm going to suggest that's actually good for you, because you've done the most amount of work on that first attack. Once you've done that first attack, all of your opponents have lost a lot of their blockers, their flying blockers, and you've at least infected a bit more, that you're probably good to go and attack again with profit, because you kept all your creatures. Now, not necessarily, because now that I think about it, a lot of those creatures that blocked would have been flyers or reach creatures, so the rest of their blockers are around. Okay, maybe not so much. Maybe I got a bit... I got a little too much in my head there. But I will say, I still think it's really, really good. You can be blown out if someone removes this after they block a bunch of your creatures. But remember, your creatures have Death Touch. They're losing their blockers either way. Just the trade is you're losing yours too. So this is a little harder to kind of... I think this is a little harder to be sure that it's good, but I think it is really, really strong. I also love this art. This art is so cool. And this entire... Obviously, we've got a wonderful quote from one of my favorite commanders, so I do really love this card. All right, our last three cards are things that I just generally like in these kind of decks, and I think are really, really good here. One of our two last 1-mana cards is Concordant Crossroads. All creatures have haste. As I've said in many, many videos, when you are the aggro deck, you love this card. Not only does it give all of your creatures haste, it also enables for you to get those attacks in. It allows you to get those attacks in because your opponents are attacking as well. None of those creatures that they play are going to stay untapped when they have the ability to attack in. Now, this doesn't work as well here because people are terrified of poison counters, so they might still keep their blockers up, but it should at least get a few blockers out of the way here and there, and you're going to be happy with that. That's, of course, not even just talking about the fact that this is just really good for your deck. This is a card that works exceedingly well with Hornet Queen, because Hornet Queen and this card is 10 poison counters onto any number of players divided, right? And that's lethal for one player, but late game, that's lethal for multiple players. So that is a combination I really like. It's a very, very good, very, very good card, and I think an easy inclusion. Now here's a card I just like in green decks, and that's Fog. This is a card your opponents would love to use against you, but unlike board clears, it is a card that you like to use as well. There is a number of cards that are just a number of decks that are really good at taking you out in combat in one turn, and Fog is very, very good at that. Or there's definitely some combats that aren't gonna go your way, and being able to, like for example, you attack with Eldrazi Monument, your opponents block a bunch of ways, make their creatures indestructible, and destroy the monument. Well, a Fog will allow you to get around this. Heroic Intervention, things like this. Anytime things don't go your way, as the aggro deck, Fog is there to keep you in the game. And I do really, really like that. But at 1 mana, you're just going to be really, really happy. Now, there is something to say about finding the other versions of this card, right? There's a lot of like different like that care about like what damage is being prevented, or like exactly where the damage is being prevented from. There's so many variants, and there are some variants that must say creatures your opponents prevent all combat damage, creatures your opponents will deal. This is no +1/+1 counters by non-green creatures. Maybe this is the best one. I'm not going to go look through all of them. There's probably a better one. But if you can find one of the ones that are one-sided, so you get your damage through and they do not, that is an option. Now, obviously, these cards are going to be 2 or 3 times the mana of Fog. So there is a downside. And I will say, for what it's worth, if you have, where are you? Questing Beast out, Fog is one-sided anyways, so you don't really need to worry about finding these other cards. So I think Fog is good enough, but if you're itching for something a little stronger, you can probably find one that allows you to basically destroy all your opponent's creatures and keep yours. So something really worth considering. And then finally, the last card, and probably the least interesting card, is Harmonize. I just like having Harmonize. I just think even at low mana, like a deck that's running really low, Harmonize is just a really, really good card that sometimes you just want the ability to say, hey, I'm just going to draw 3 cards. That's all that really matters. So I think it's a nice staple in green, and you should always be playing it. This is like my read the bones of green, if you follow my gist. And that's generally going to be it in what I have to say about the deck. I think it's really strong. I think it's in a very, very good place. I think it works. It's a straightforward kind of deck because, like, when you build Fynn, this is the deck you're building. But it doesn't feel like you're kind of locked into one kind of strategy with it. I would say there is a slower version of Fynn out there where you can use cards that kind of, you can go wide, you can kind of do more into the ramp, you can kind of build out a different kind of board with the threatening effect of Fynn just being out there, just threatening to poison people. And then, of course, you could play a version of Fynn with all the infect cards and toxic cards that this deck is not running. So you have a lot of different options in a deck like this, and I do really like this version. I think these additions are going to be really good. I will say I do think Rancor is probably the strongest one outside of the 1-mana creatures. I do also, I think Infectious Bite as well. I am really curious about Eldrazi Monument. I think it could be very, very good, but I could also see it being like just okay, or you know, the downside being too strong against you. So there's some testing required, but I think it'll do very well. All right. If you would like to send me another draft of this deck or any deck, there is a link in the video description below. And if you would like that deck to be the next one I work on, or one of my two decks every time I make videos, there's a link for that as well. And if you could like, comment, subscribe, do the whole YouTube thing, I would be eternally grateful. Thank you so much, Phil, for sending this deck and supporting the channel so much. Your encouragement has been really, really nice, and I do really appreciate it. And I hope to see this deck played soon. It is really, really fun looking, and like I love these kind of aggro strategies. So seeing this deck come together looks like it would be a lot of fun. All right, good luck.